Good afternoon. I'm Corinne Doud from Mothers Out Front Bedford, and the purpose of this meeting, which we will be recording, is to brainstorm possible follow-on actions in response to the air quality study titled The Impacts of Aviation Emissions on Air Quality near Hanscom Field, Bedford, Massachusetts. Earlier this year, Mothers Out Front Bedford co-sponsored with the League of Women Voters of Bedford, Third Act Bedford, and the Bedford Board of Health, the September 30th public forum at which Dr. Hudda presented the air quality study findings. Since then, there has been a great deal of interest in pursuing recommendations made in Dr. Hudda's report and figuring out a plan. For example, an area of interest is air quality monitors to measure ultrafine particles to get more data. And that raises questions like what type of monitors, how many, where should they go, and how to fund them. While town and state funds may have been considered, there is a precedent for Massport funding high-quality air quality monitors for the Logan communities through MCAC, the Massport Community Advisory Committee, for which Hanscom area towns might also qualify. Also, regarding Dr. Hudda's report, how will the towns disseminate the scientific information in such a way that the public can better understand the scope of the health and climate impacts, and also so that we can be informed of possible next steps? Today, Dr. Neelakshi Hudda will highlight possible follow-on actions from her report, and then we'll open it up for discussion facilitated by Alex Chatfield. As ideas are explored, it would be great to assign some action items, which Lora Goldenberg will recap before closing the meeting. So, Dr. Hudda, thank you so much for joining us today. And based on your report findings, we look forward to hearing what you see as possible next steps for the towns to consider.
Thank you for the introduction, Corinne. I want to start with just generally recapping why we undertook the study that we undertook and what we found, and then move on to what I think are some of the gaps that can be addressed. So the purpose of this study that led to the finding that, well, I'm doing a little bit of reverse order. So what was the finding? The finding was that the operations as is, whatever they are at Hanscom right now, do lead to elevated concentrations of ultrafine particles, particularly in areas that are downwind when the operations are happening. Now, predominantly what's downwind of Hanscom is Bedford and to some extent Lexington. But when the winds shift, you can see the same impact on the other side in Concord. But for most part, it's Bedford, Lexington area that is to the east that's predominantly downwind. And Bedford we did see like disproportionately being impacted by those emissions just by the sheer fact that the winds blow from the west most of the time. The reason we undertook this study was that we had no information on what the baseline air quality is around Hanscom to begin with, especially in the light of the proposed Northfield redevelopment program. So when we undertook the study, the idea was just to fill in or know some basic information, really elementary, around an area where the amount of information that existed was zero. Another thing to note here is it's not that we don't know what the impacts of aircraft activity on air quality around the airports are. We know that those are adverse, but those studies have been done at big, large commercial airports. And what differentiates big, large commercial airports from smaller airports like Hanscom or general aviation airports is that communities literally abut the fence line of the airport. There's often just a chain linked fence separating the airport from people's backyards. Right? At big, large commercial airports, there's a little bit of runway protection zone or a big sort of gap between where the maximum thrust of the airplane is when it's taking off versus someone's backyard. That's not the case at GAAs. People literally live next door to the airports. So with that in mind, we wanted to capture what the baseline information is around that airport, around Hanscom. And we did an elementary campaign, which was let's just make some measurements in two contrasting seasons, summer and winter, because we know seasons do play a role, local meteorology and nature, forces of nature do play a role, but also there's a little bit of a difference in the activity between the summer and winter. So we picked these two contrasting seasons. We made measurements for about a month or so. We voluntarily actually expanded some, made some measurements, longer measurements in Bedford. Another thing that we did was we came up with this design of like, let's make measurements a couple of places so that we understand not just what the impact is, but at least get some sense of how far out from the airport it spreads and what part of the community is impacted. So there's a little bit of rotational design in which we wanted to have some sites on either side of the runway and spread out in the community a little bit, but still closer to the airport. What the study did find was, and this is what we expected, that when there's flight activity, especially during the hours where it's flight activity, not the times when there was no flight activity, we sort of separated the data that during the times when there's flight activity and the wind is from the direction of the airport, we the concentration of ultrafine particles is exceeded more frequently. A, it's the rate at which the concentrations exceed a threshold goes up, and B, the concentrations themselves are higher. And what are those thresholds? Those were thresholds that were based on WHO, World Health Organization guidelines. And they have two thresholds. One is a short-term, 1 hour threshold. One is a 24 hours, just to give you a broader picture. Right? And both of those thresholds were exceeded and were exceeded more frequently when the wind was from the direction of the airport and flight activity was occurring. Um, what we did find was there certain areas that were impacted when the wind shifted. The other area that wasn't wind shifted, the concentrations went down, and then when the wind shifted from the direction of the airport, it went up. Did we map out the entire extent in all four communities that are impacted? No. This was a very basic preliminary study, but we did establish some sort of a ground-based information or truth as to what is the impact within these communities. Um, Let me to see. I'm just trying to go over like main points. And one of the key questions that you might ask me, and I'll get often gets asked is, why ultrafine particles and why the focus on ultrafine particles? And you've heard me say that maybe a few times. And that's pretty much the only thing we measured, other than we also measured some airborne lead in certain particles. That was a smaller part of the study, and I can discuss that in detail if you have questions later on. But I want to focus on ultrafine particles because anytime you burn fossil fuel, we produce a lot of these particles. And what do jets do is they burn a lot of fossil fuel, so they produce a lot more of those ultrafine particles, big giant bursts and blooms of ultrafine particles. And I can measure them with very high accuracy and confidence with the machines that we have. And that gives me combined together, that gives me the ability to then track out what part of the community is getting impacted by these fresh jet emissions. By no means is jet emission comprised solely of ultrafine particles. There's a whole bunch of things that are in there, but this is an excellent marker to track out where those impacts are hitting the ground, which part of the community is impacted. Therefore, our choice of ultrafine particles, which is not to say that ultrafine particles themselves are not harmful. They are a harmful pollutant, and they're linked to systemic inflammation. But our tool of choice here was ultrafine particles because it lets me do my job with high degree of accuracy and confidence in my findings. Therefore, we chose those. And with that, I'll pause for questions. If you have any questions, any part of the study I should discuss, and otherwise I'll go forward with my recommendations a little bit. Okay. So, based on what I found, I think there's clearly more work to be, I think there's clearly more work to be done, right? We did two short seasons. We know a little bit about summer and winter. We know about certain things about a few locations. but we don't know what the full extent of the impact within the communities are, which are the subpopulations within the communities that are impacted. So take, for example, Bedford. Not all parts of Bedford are impacted equally, right? Or for that matter, Bedford is impacted a little more than Lexington, far more actually than Lexington, depends on which part of Lexington you're talking about. So within the all four communities that together funded this in equal amounts, there's a little bit of disparity in population exposure to these ultrafine particles. There's a little bit of disparity in where those, um, for lack of a better word, deterioration of air quality occurs and for how long, right? Not everybody sort of in all directions suffers equally from this impact. So those questions still linger. Second question that still lingers is, all right, great, we did this work, we made measurements, we did it in people's backyards. That's the ambient space. People don't spend their times living in their backyards. They live inside their houses. Does any of this pollution get indoors? Does it impact people indoors where they spend 80% or more of their time in that indoor space? What are those exposures like? Um, and I can argue that in a couple of ways. Yes, each house is different. Each community's housing stock is a little bit different. But there has been work done, at least in one house in Winthrop, where we've clearly demonstrated that about 70% of what we find outdoors makes its way indoors. And these exposures matter in indoor space as well as in outdoor space. So there's that little arguments to be built up just to complete the picture as well. Um, Third thing that I would say is equally important in all of this is how do we communicate these findings in a rational way? Because by no means ultrafine particles are being created by just jet emissions, right? We burn fossil fuel in cars. Some of us have natural gas stoves. Anytime you burn fossil fuel, we're making ultrafine particles. And if you travel in the Big Dick Tunnel and you forget to put your car on recirculation, that's it. That's like your boom, couple of days of exposure right there and 5 minutes of travel, right? So it's a complicated picture and it's a comprehensive picture that should be sort of laid out in a very clear way to the communities that are living these exposures. So that would be my third recommendation is how do we communicate this in a rational way and in a comprehensive and a complete way, trying to put this in perspective.
Okay. Laura, did you have your hand up there for a moment? You're muted.
Mark Sandine did before me, so I'll wait.
Okay. If people would like to, it's easier to keep track of the order if people click the raise hand button down below that comes up when you click the react icon. Mark, what's on your
Yes.
mind?
So I'm Mark Sandine. I'm a Lexington Select Board member and also currently the chair of the Hanscom Area Towns Committee. And I just wanted to mention that the Hanscom Area Towns Committee sent a letter to Massport on a related subject. Massport asked for comments on their environmental status and planning report. And so we sent a letter to Massport in 2024 that says this. Air pollution measurement locations is the topic. And it says the ESPR states that air quality measurements for Hanscom Airfield take place in Chelmsford, which is 11 miles north of Hanscom, and in Boston, which is 14 miles southwest of Hanscom. And our comments continue. It is not possible that air quality measurements taken so far from Hanscom can in any way be meaningful measure of the actual air pollution emissions from Hanscom Airfield. We would request that Massport measure and report actual emissions on the airfield to validate the theoretically calculated emissions reported in the ESPR. The draft ESPR also mentions that site-specific monitoring for NO2 was performed in 1995. Measurements conducted almost 30 years ago do not accurately reflect the conditions of today. So that was our comment, and I just wanted to let you know that's what the official position of the Hanscom Area Towns Committee was on this topic.
Mark, may I ask if you received any reply?
No, we didn't.
Okay, thank you. for that comment. And as people chime in, if you would just like to introduce yourself with a quick phrase, just so we're all aware of people's affiliations. Lora.
Mark, I'm sure we've seen that letter, but is it possible for you to send it to Corinne, and she'll send it out, for example, to everybody, just to remind us what you did. Thank you. And my question is about lead, because I know it's a whole different thing. I know that aviation is trying to get rid of the fuel that creates lead in the kind of planes that use that by 2030 or something was the date I had recently heard. But I know that even though we know that the ultrafine particles are critical, a lot of individuals in our communities are concerned about lead. It's something we've been hearing about for however many years. Not necessarily to do with airplanes, but in other ways. So my question to you, is there anything that we ought to consider, this is to Dr. Hudda, to either estimate the planes at Hanscom that produce the lead and how much it adds to our background? I don't know if that's something feasible and whether it's worth anybody's time or energy. And otherwise, how do we address the lead issue that we're going to get asked about by many members of our communities?
I have two answers to this question. One is on the yes track and the other is on the no track. And I think it's important to be forthright about both of those. So yes, we made measurements of lead. We found somewhat higher concentrations than where lead is measured in Nubian Square, because there's an EPA site, speciation site, and and regulatory authorities are required to make measurements of lead. Why wouldn't there be higher lead concentrations around general aviation airports where leaded fuel is being burned, right? If we had not found it, then something is wrong with our measurement methods, right? We're not doing our work right. Were they off the charts high? No, not in the samples we collected. They weren't. Is it a possibility that there's a time and a place where they are? I don't know. We haven't made very comprehensive measurements. Is it possible to both A, measure, and B, estimate contributions to lead? Yes. For most part, all this modeling work is done through AEDT. The lead emissions are pretty well known. You plug it in, you look at the inventory of how many planes or flight activity is happening, and you can develop really good estimates of what the impacts are. Alternative is you can make some validated measurements too. You can validate those estimates and then go and actually make measurements and say, all right, this seems to be reasonable. We don't have to go wild on making hundreds of measurements in airborne lead. So that's on the yes track. Like, all of this is possible, right? Let's say we do all this. What's the answer on the no track? Lead exposures are multi-pathway, right? Airborne lead and breathing it in, or maybe it lands on your garden veggie and consuming it. It's like just one of the pathways of exposure. Lead pathway is very complicated. Does making those measurements sort of mollify an individual's concern about lead? I am not sure. It's definitely a piece of information. Where it fits in their whole life's profile and their exposure profile, I don't know. And will that solve their concerns some way? I don't know. Right? Maybe if I was genuinely concerned about my lead levels, I'd rather go get a blood test. Right? That would mollify my concerns. Or right, having information on airborne lead for a season or maybe even annual averages, maybe as a community, it might put our minds at rest, at ease, right? If we knew that we're looking at an increment of only 1 nanogram per meter cube as opposed to 15. But that would be sort of like my range of answers there.
Thanks, Dr. Hudda. That's great. Aaron, you're up next.
Thanks, Alex. Hi, I'm Aaron Toffler. I'm the executive director of the Massport Community Advisory Committee, on which Alex sits and ably represents your communities, among others. I just wanted to make the point that the MCAC did, and I think you all probably know this, but I didn't hear it mentioned yet in this meeting, but in addition to the town's funding, Dr. Hudda's work around Hanscom over the past year, the MCAC's participated in that to the extent of $25,000 for the monitoring and the analysis of the results. So we are in a position now where we are doing some similar monitoring around Logan Airport. We have 3 of these sort of lower cost Quant-AQ monitors around Logan right now, and we have 1 of what I've learned to call reference grade monitors around Logan. So there are 4 in total. I think and I think I've said this in this context before, if I'm sort of sensing where this might be going at some point, there may be interest in MCAC funding some further work around Hanscom. I don't have the authority to do that myself. I have to go to my committee with an ask, which I am happy to do, but I'm pretty sure that there's going to be some kind of process that needs to be put in place, because we do represent 35 communities, 4 of which are around Hanscom, some of which are around Worcester Airport, and many of which are around Logan. So I just want to make that point before it comes to me directly, right?
Can I just ask, who would you want, HVAC or HATS or the 4 towns or the boards of health? Who would make that request to MCAC? That's all.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it would probably come from the MCAC reps. So Alex, Ira Goldman is another rep. I'm probably not going to, Heidi Porter from Bedford, who was one of the co-sponsors, I think, of Dr. Hudda's presentation in September. And there's one other whose name I'm not remembering right now.
Great. Janet, you're in the queue.
I just wanted to say I have a public health background. I did my internship at the Childhood Lead Poisoning Prevention Program, and my guess would be the best way to ascertain the lead exposure would be to, as Dr. Hudda said, to do lead tests, most likely in children. They get routine tests at, I believe it's age 1 or under, and then again around 5 or so, I think around the time they enter school. So you could look at the results of those. You could just pick out, I'm sure we could devise a way to survey that, so that's a possibility if anybody's interested.
Great. So as I was thinking about facilitating and focusing on the possible follow-up actions that Dr. Hudda just mentioned, they really fall into 3 priority categories, I would say. The question of what additional air monitoring should we do going forward, knowing that there would be some expense involved and knowing that it would be important to choose the right equipment and the right strategies. But as I look at that, I think the opportunity to create a multi-year data set is very exciting, and I think where in the recommendations where it talks about giving us the opportunity to use the data to inform decisions regarding proposed changes to aviation activities at Hanscom, I know there would be a lot of interest in the community from the folks that I've talked to have that data and to be able, hopefully, to use it in informing decision making. And then there's the question of monitoring in buildings and the question of outreach materials and communication strategies for the citizenry. Because I think we know from feedback that has come from presentations and meetings that the concerns are out there, but there may also be a bunch of people who don't know much about this at all and haven't been reached in the right ways and with the right materials. And it would be a shame to have gone to all this effort and expense and not really reach sort of a saturation level of knowledge in the community. And at the moment, I'm just going to suggest we deprioritize talking about Logan style sound insulation. That really hasn't come up in this discussion right now. And I think it feels to me like a longer term, more specific kind of initiative. Not to say that it might not be very helpful to certain people. So I wonder if we could start perhaps with another round of comments about the question of ongoing monitoring, either from Dr. Hudda or others, so that we get a sense of what the best scope of that might be, the frequency, how often it might occur, and yeah, again, what it might cost. That would help us determine who to ask for money and how much money. Dr. Hudda.
I should have mentioned one more thing, Alex, my bad. It's also important to develop communication materials for decision makers in all of these towns, right?
Mm-hmm.
Be it the Planning and Development Board, be it the Board of Health. So everybody in the town has knowledge when they're sort of making some decisions as to who is going to be in the crosspath of these high exposures. Whatever happens with the Hanscom expansion, whether it goes through or it doesn't go through, we know that people who are living closer and closer, those people would have higher exposures. Is it a great idea to build maybe early childhood education centers near airports? Probably not. Is it a great idea to build new residential housing? If there's a choice, really next to the airport, probably not. Maybe, I mean, it's just my personal opinion. If I was a decision maker, I would say it's better to put an office complex with limited time of exposure, closed buildings. You're not opening your windows that much. You can afford ventilation systems that run really well during a limited time. But there are ways to sort of develop in a more compatible way around airports that reduce people's exposures to harmful air pollution.
Thank you. Okay. So people's thoughts about ongoing monitoring and how desirable that is and what we would like to learn from that. Corinne.
So I had attended the Bedford Board of Health meeting when Dr. Hudda was a guest speaker there. And the board was talking about, we basically just need to figure out a plan. There's different options, whether you want to do a consulting option for looking at monitors. It might be a much less expensive option than a long-term option of purchasing the monitors. And I really think we need to look at this as a long-term issue. Secondly, if we're going to the trouble of getting data, I think it is critical that we get really good quality monitors to ensure that the data that we get is something that we can trust.
Thank you. Laura?
I agree with Corinne, and I would like to say, how do we go about determining what equipment we would get if we decide we want to go in that direction? Is that something Dr. Hudda can give us advice about, or we need to hire some other consulting people, or do the boards of health already have? I see Bee's got her hand up. I just, how do we determine what we should get, I guess, is what I'm asking at this point.
Great. Dr. Hudda, do you want to address that question?
Sure. So if we so for I'm gonna answer it in a long way. So if I was doing this, I would start with like, okay, what kind of actionable items or what kind of actions are possible? Then set up a study to develop actionable data on them. So let's hypothetically, let's say we want to know what the concentration difference is between the first 500 meters around the airport versus between the next 500 to 1,000 meters away from the airport, right? That gives us some actionable information on how to develop land around airport. What's like, or what is the difference in parity? Okay, that gives you a way you can sort of come up with a monitoring campaign. That tells you, and then you have a separate line item of how much budget you have. All right, that lets me that will help you decide how many monitors you can put out and for how long you can run this. But let's say budget is no option, budget is unlimited, right? It's not a constraint here. So you design the study, you pick the best reference monitor, which is TSI condensation particle counter, which we use, and I have at this point 7 of them sitting in the lab with no use because all funding for them has been canceled. So they're just sitting there. Anyone's welcome to them. Uh, you can there's a little bit of maintenance cost, I should say, like annual maintenance cost, which Aaron is well aware of now that MCAC owns one of those. You need somebody who really knows how to run those machines too. So one recommendation would be you don't just want to buy machines. You want to preserve people's time or get access to people's times and brains, right? That's always my preferred approach, right? They'll know they'll come with machines, they'll fix their machines, they know how to do this. But what's more valuable is people's experience and time that you want to get hold of. They'll deliver for you. You set out these TSI condensation particle counters, which is what Mass DEP uses, which is the gold standard. There are other less expensive options. They, on the face of it, appear less expensive. What you save up front in terms of capital costs, you spend sometimes just haggling your on time that is required to haggle with data, make sense of it, chasing someone down who's gonna work with you, give you the report, and analyzing the data with you. That being said, Aaron is a great resource too because they've come up with a tool as well, which I would just say 2 of the sensors are working. One of them is not quite working and made very little sense. But then, sorry, what I got lost in the answer. Good, went down the road too long. But the answer is that there's a gold standard instrument. If you're going to be doing it long term, it might make sense to buy it. If it's not long term, then might just get a consultant who has access to a whole bunch of them. I do. Get a consultant who's willing to come at time. How much of the monitoring is needed it's an open-ended question, but at least 12 months at a location that's centralized. And then you can come up with a clever design of rotating some monitors so you can assess the spatial gradient with reference to the one that's always there and making measurements. So it depends on what the actionable data is that's being generated. Study design is the last thing that you want to work on because it's very hypothesis driven, very driven by what the end goal is that how you want the data to deliver. If it's just open-ended with just weird, the end goal here is information, then that's a completely different sort of a study design in which you can just, I mean, you can have it, you want at least 2 monitors there to give you temporal sense and a spatial sense. But so my answer is minimum 2, and then after that, sky is the limit, depending on what kind of a hypothesis or actionable data we're trying to generate.
Thank you. B.
Hey everyone, I'm B. Brunkhorst. I'm the current chair of the Bedford Board of Health. And yes, been talking with Dr. Hudda for a while, and the Board of Health is very interested, of course, in pursuing more monitoring because one of our dreams actually is to use these data for a standard. As Dr. Hudda mentioned, the current standard is made by the World Health Organization. But the EPA doesn't have a current standard for ultrafine particles. So, we like to think of long-term. And so I think, we would agree with what Lora said, that, we would be interested in a long-term. What would the Board of Health's role be? Well, so it's interesting. Unfortunately, Heidi Porter had planned to come to this meeting, but she had a death in her family. She couldn't make it at the last minute. But you know, if we need to make a request to MCAC, I'm sure she'd be interested in doing that. Also, the role of the Board of Health, we feel, could be the communication piece, or at least part of the communication piece. Right now, for instance, that forum that we co-sponsored in September, we've made sure that is hosted on the Bedford Town website, so it has a place. That's an easy thing. But maybe we could look into more of a regional idea, right? Of all the Hanscom affected towns, right? And come up with a good communication plan there. Currently, Bedford is part of a consortium. It doesn't include all the Hanscom towns, but some of them. A health consortium where we have access to a communication expert who may be able to help us as well. So that's what I wanted to say, is that the Bedford Board of Health has a recurring interest in this. We're thinking about trying to make it some kind of goal, and what can we do? And we really felt that in the end, it would be the communication piece, could be something that we could really help here. So yeah, looking forward to getting more definition around that, what that could mean. Thanks.
Thank you. Dr. Hudda?
On that note, Alex, I'd also like to chime in and say that once any community has a long-term data set, right? It's not that it can be used only just for near Hanscom purposes. A long-term data set means the wind is blowing from many different directions. We've had measurements at many different locations. It gives you insight into what else is important within the community. Let's not forget, there's a major interstate highway that runs through our communities, right? Which is not very often talked about. Right? A lot of fossil fuel gets burnt on that. How does that compare to what the contribution from Hanscom is, right? That's more of an influential factor in Lexington, right? So each community might have its own sort of priority order of things, but these instruments or this investment into understanding the air quality better in our communities and the contribution of sources, I think serves the community better in long term, making better decisions for its residents in terms of limiting exposure. And there's a model for that. I think lots of boards of health share equipment across towns often, right? And maybe I didn't mention NO2, but NO2 measurements is something I can do really well. And there is a standard for that. Those should be understood. What it will also let us or the communities do is develop an understanding of air quality in their community and how it compares to other communities in Massachusetts, because Mass DEP is now making ultrafine measurements in other parts of the state, right? And it's a big state. Everybody wants more measurements, so they've had a priority order as to where they would invest and put the equipment out first. But it also helps communities peg sort of where their air quality is compared to other communities if we're sort of using the same standards of doing the work long term.
I have a question, and I'm not sure who I'm asking it to, so if anybody wants to address it, but I've been thinking about this sentence at the end of the first follow-up action, which says, long-term monitoring would allow towns to keep better track of air quality in their communities and to use the data to inform decisions regarding proposed changes to aviation activities at Hanscom. And coming from the perspective of the coalition to stop private jet expansion at Hanscom or anywhere, we've learned that decisions about aviation expansion are not made at the level of our local communities. And some state officials have told us they're not even made at the state level, that we have FAA regulations that override or sort of take away the ability of the state to make certain decisions. So I'm just thinking about how more data and a longer term data set might actually be used in advocacy, in communication, in using whatever slender threads of regulatory authority the state does have, and how that in a way ties into the communication process or communication materials that might be developed. And I don't know, Aaron, if you have thoughts about that, or if some of our elected officials or members of commissions who are present would like to chime in on that piece. Yeah.
I'm happy to take not to answer it, Alex, because I'm not sure I have the answer, but I'll make a comment on it. I think what B said is exactly right, and what at least the MCAC shares the long-term goal that the Bedford Board of Health has to try to change the regulatory system. That is obviously a long-term proposal, right? I mean, and we have initiated conversations with other airport, community groups, roundtables, we call them, around the country, to start to have that conversation, to see if we can put together sort of a more national coalition of people who are interested in that. So that is one thing that we are certainly supportive of. But again, given what Dr. Hudda just said about particularly the state of the funding, that's coming from the federal government right now, that's made even more difficult by that. The other thing, Alex, is the fact is that the people who are telling you that they don't have regulatory authority at the local and state level are telling you the truth largely. This is a national issue, and I think ultimately it needs to be addressed at the national level. Does that mean that state or local boards of health or local planning boards can't adopt some regulations that might help? It does not mean that, I don't think. But I think if you want to really go at the problem sort of right at its heart, it is both a longer term project and probably one that would require the participation of groups from a greater geographic area.
Lora.
I don't want to cut off discussion at all, but I think there are a lot of people in this meeting for whom there are about 75 other things they need to be worried about, including maybe going to a select board meeting tonight.
Sure.
So I was wondering if everybody was comfortable enough for us to talk about taking the next steps and taking some responsibility for what those are. I think we've talked a lot about what we might want to do. I think leaving lead aside at this point, and probably NO2 aside at this point, I think that everybody has expressed some interest in us trying to go forward with monitors for the particulates. And so I was wondering whether our sorry, I'm going to ruin the acronym for the Mass uh, Aviation Group. Could you guys take that on as just exploring how we need to ask, how we get the resources? I think Dr. Hudda would give us an idea of who to ask to set this up, and I think she's been very clear about doing it, not just throwing the monitors out there, but getting some real consulting help to make this happen. So that I'm wondering whether I can throw that against your wall, Alex and Aaron and the others who represent our communities on that committee.
Oh, we can absolutely take that on, and
Okay.
I think there will also need to be some outreach to some of the other groups that participated in the original plan from last year or the year before.
That's wonderful. I think that it's just really important that we go out of here knowing somebody is going to go the next place on this, and we can all get back together. The other thing is the part of the of trying to pass this information out to everyone. There have been a lot of ideas out there. I mean, certainly we have 4 communities that have local newspapers, the Carlisle Mosquito, the Concord
Bridge.
the Bedford newspaper, and then Lexington has, I think it's called the Observer too, and Lincoln has
The Squirrel.
I think. Yes. So we have those things. We all have cable TV things. So we certainly should start thinking about how we structure routine communications through those medias. And I would be glad if this is useful to everybody to make sure that those newspapers and also the leagues of women voters unfortunately, there is not one in Lincoln, but the other communities are talking about this. What about who might be interested in helping design materials, and we talked about a one-sheet thing, we talked about mailers, we talked about things with whatchamacallit, codes on them so people can go in and look, handing them out at town meetings, at any other options we have coming down the road. The other thing that I had said I would do when we did the planning meeting was to go to our town moderator and ask whether a report from Board of Health or whoever the appropriate town committee at the beginning of town meeting about what's going on now would be allowed. I mean, right now we just usually have finance committee, capital expenditures, a few other people that are always giving a report at the beginning of town meeting. And I'm wondering whether we could add to that and if the other communities could too. Concord and Lincoln and Carlisle all have open town meetings as Bedford does, but Lexington has representative town meetings, so I don't know exactly how all that would work. And I'll stop talking, and because Corinne's got something to add.
Over to you, Corinne.
Yeah, first I want to say I totally agree with what Lora is saying, that with respect to sharing this information, like right now, there are very limited sources to where the information is. You can go, if you know exactly where to go on the Board of Health website, you can find the link to the report. If you go to a certain Bedford Citizen article, it links to the report. It might be on the hats or hat. HVAC, I'm not sure. But anyways, I think it's so important to reach people in different modes because some people, they don't read the paper. Some people, they would only respond if they get a postcard in the mail or, as you said, possibly having an announcement about the town meeting. I think that would be great. So getting the information out in different ways. And years ago, actually, Sue and I attended a brainstorming meeting about our municipal vulnerable preparedness. And I remember in one of the breakout groups, one of the things that really surprised me was the demographics of how many people in Bedford English is not their first language. What about reaching those people? But anyways, I actually had my hand up earlier when we were talking about whose responsibility is this? And, sometimes it's not the town, the state, or even beyond are claiming that they can oversee this. And I just wanted to mention that the Bedford Planning Board is promoting a public forum this coming Thursday on the town comprehensive plan. And a question that I've had is if you look at the old 2013 comprehensive plan, there might be, pictures of the Hanscom and various things, but there's not much said about it. And for this coming one, and I did ask our previous energy and sustainable manager about it, and he said, oh, well, we're not including it because we don't really have responsibility for it. But should that be in a comprehensive plan? I don't know. I mean, I certainly would like to see it, but so if anyone has thoughts on that I would say contact me separately about that. But anyways, I think it's great that both B is saying the Board of Health wants to be part of the communication piece, and that Laura is saying the league, possibly in different towns, could contribute to that as well.
Okay, we'll move things right along because it's 5 of 5. Sue. Unmute.
Sorry. This is really good. They're definitely next steps, but before we do much more, don't we really need to clarify our next goal? Are we just looking for monitors? And as Dr. Hudda said, we need to identify the goal, and then we will be able to identify the appropriate monitors and all that kind of thing. So,
What do you mean? What goal?
are we just collecting data right now? Is that the goal? Is just to develop a long-term data set? I'm not making any suggestions. I'm confused. What is the goal of this PR? What are we going to say? What is the purpose of MCAC working? Do we all know do we all agree on whatever it is?
I think it's been recommended by Dr. Hudda that we continue to do monitoring or do it in different ways and more long-term and other parts of the year and those kind of things. So I think, and given that we may be able to get funding without having to stand on a street corner, I think that everybody is willing to do that. I think we have a lot of data and from the report that we can be passing out now through the boards of health, through other organizations. And then if and when we get more from our future work, then we will continue to pass that information on. Does that make it any clearer, Sue? I'm sorry to be the one to.
So no, what we decided to do is just get more data. So that is our immediate goal.
If I may just step in real
Please,
quickly.
yeah, please do.
So my experience of working on such matters with the communities is that like the parallel track is perhaps the best to take because these things take a little while to develop. Like by the time the funding comes online, you have this window of time that lets you decide what your action priorities are. And then when the funding comes online, you know exactly how much funding you have and what your action priorities are. You design the study, or maybe the study is as simple as gather more data. at that point. But I think like it's almost all parallel track might be the best approach. We have time to decide the priorities while we're working out the funding.
Thank you. Janet.
Oh, I don't have the bandwidth to take the lead on this, but I can offer that I am the chair of the environmental action I'm the environmental chair of the League of Women Voters for Concord Carlisle, and we have I think a couple hundred people get the newsletter, which comes out every 2 weeks. So we could put an article, we could give an update or whatever kind of thing we want to do. Concord Can, I'm on the steering committee for that, and we put out a newsletter once a month, and I think we have something like 600 people on that, extending out mostly Concord, but also Acton in the area. And then I have connections with Mothers Out Front. They seem to have their own way of doing things, but if we had anything, well, Corinne knows more about them than me. And I'm sorry I'm on two different screens here. I look at you here, and I know you look at me over in this one. But anyway, so there's some, if you want communication to a group of people, I can help facilitate that. That's all I had to say.
Well, and it would be nice if these efforts are made to write an article or a newsletter blurb or a 5-minute announcement that gets made at a town meeting. It would be really nice if those could be shared among communities so people don't have to do all that work over and over again.
Yeah, I'm a huge proponent of this. Somebody put together a bunch of factual bullet points, and then somebody else who can string together some nouns and verbs. Like I'm good at nouns and verbs. I'm good at research, but I don't have the bandwidth to do that.
We know you're good at many things, Janet.
So
Mark.
yeah. Okay.
I just go back to the first comment I made. This whole conversation since that first comment is about who's going to come up with funding and where's the funding going to come from. And the first comment that HATS made was that HATS requested that Massport measure and report actual emissions on the airfield. So I wouldn't lose sight of that.
I think Massport funds MCAC, does it?
They do. I would also just add to that when you start talking about what Massport is going to be asked to do, there are a lot of interests that are going to that trough. And to be quite frank about it, Logan Airport has many times the impact that Hanscom does on the surrounding communities. There is an environmental justice component, and my organization represents all of those communities. And so, we need to figure out a way, if we are going to be asked to participate in the funding, how to do that in a way that's equitable and fair across all communities. And that's not, as I think Dr. Hudda was sort of referencing, that's not going to be figured out by tomorrow. So I commit to working on that, absolutely, and we'll start the conversation as soon as I can. But I am anticipating a great deal of interest in any potential funding that might be available.
Great. Well, it is 5 o'clock. I wanted to thank many people, but I think especially Corinne for her work in convening this meeting and giving us an agenda and inviting folks and making it such a productive use of time. And of course, Dr. Hudda for her ongoing work and dedication to these issues, and for the work that's already been done and all the information that's been shared with so many people. And I think the concern and interest that it has already generated speaks for itself in terms of how valuable that's been. So thank you very much. And we do have some follow-up items to do, and perhaps it will be appropriate to get this group back together again, in the near term to follow up and sort of see where we're at. Does anybody have any final thoughts to share or a closing? Yeah.
If we get together again, I think it's really important that we get representatives from Select Board, Board of Health, of all of the communities, if it's possible. I know that makes it a much bigger meeting, but you know, because Corinne is Corinne and she makes sure the Bedford does things, we need to keep pushing at the other communities as well. So
Yeah, this is a first step. And by the way, I want to thank everyone for taking the time to be here and for having this conversation. But there's definitely more work to do.
and thank you, Dr. Hudda, again and again and again for
Oh,
coming
my
and
pleasure. I'm just doing
explaining.
my work as a fellow
No,
resident in the
you've done
communities.
your work, and then you do it again, and then you come and talk to us again, and so we're very grateful. So,
All right. Well, thank you, everyone, and have a great evening.
Thanks, Corinne.
Bye-bye.